Hi, I'm Effie, and over the past few weeks I have been attempting to read a whole category of the Goodreads Choice Awards. This is my third time attempting to read the complete long list of a category, and I'll be honest, this is probably the hardest one I've had because this year I decided, why not tackle fantasy? I will pop on screen how many total pages the whole fantasy category is, but I feel like it was quite a lot. So many pages to tackle. Before the long list was announced, I'd managed to read 4 of the books that made it onto the long list: The Last Tale of the Flower Bride, The Fragile Threads of Power, The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi, and Starling House. I also was currently reading, I say that because I got an extended sampler of Swordcatcher before it came out, but then had to wait for it to be published to be able to read the second half. So Swordcatcher was one of the ones I was currently reading. The other one was A Day of Fallen Night. So in total, I had to read 15 complete books and then finish 2 further books in order to carry out this challenge, and obviously I only had about 3 weeks to do so. And if you're wondering about the maths, I had to read Ninth House before I could read Hellbent, so that I added an extra book to my list. I'm just going to have a quick section of girl math here and tell you how I managed to complete a whole category without spending a penny, but in very much girl math terms. And before anyone says anything, girl math is gender free, it's a state of mind. So obviously we rule out the 4 that I'd already read because, you know, I already had read those. And then I owned A Day of Fallen Night, so that's that one out of the way. Ninth House I owned, but also I was able to get a copy on KU, so I was able to read it on my Kindle. And then Audible was the real, lifesaver, because there was no way I was going to get through this category without using Audible. I read about 25 pages an hour when I'm reading physically, so it was audiobooks or I wasn't going to get this done. So at the start I had 6 credits on Audible because apparently I just hoard my Audible credits, and I know that 6 is the most you can have if you're on a month-to-month subscription. So I was really lucky that I had exactly 6. In addition to that, they had a 2-for-1 offer, and 2 of the titles on the list were actually on Audible. So I was able to get Hellbent and Atalanta for 2-for-1. And then with the remaining 5 credits, I got Bookshops and Bone Dust, Clytemnestra, Witch King, Will of the Many, and Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries. I then realised that I had an audiobook that I'd bought earlier in the year that I didn't want anymore, so I was able to return that and get another credit. So I got Inkblood Sister Scribe, and then genuinely was not trying to game the system. I want to give up Audible at the end of the year, so I went to cancel my subscription and Audible were like, oh, have a credit. So I was able to get The Unmaking of June Farrow. And then for the remaining titles, I was able to get The Book That Wouldn't Burn in audiobook form on Scribe, and Tress of the Emerald Sea in ebook form on Scribe. And then from my library, or from various libraries, I was able to get the audiobook for Victory City, Stoneblind, and Swordcatcher. So basically, that's how I did the whole category without spending a penny, but in girl math terms, because I'm well aware that I only had credits because I pay for Audible and Scribe. No, I keep forgetting. Scribe, I had a free trial, and every month for about 6 months, when I went to cancel, they were like, oh, do you just want another free month? So Scribe I literally didn't pay for. So it's just the Audible ones, but you know, if you've already bought the credit, it doesn't count as spending money. So that's how I did the whole category without spending money. Because it would be really expensive to have had to buy 15 plus books in order to complete this. So the way that I approached this was I started by, well, first off, I read Ninth House. Got that out of the road. And then I went through the first chapters of all of the books that I either hadn't read or wasn't currently reading. And I ranked those books from basically like most interesting to least interesting. But then in order to keep my momentum up, I started reading them from the book that I was least interested in to the book that I was most interested in the thought that I would end my reading on the book that I enjoyed the most. I'm going to pop a graphic on screen now. Okay, so after I had ranked the books based on the first chapter, I then created a predicted ranking for how I thought I was going to rank all of the books in this category based on what I thought of the first chapter. I will say that the order that these books appear on screen is not necessarily the order that I rank them based on their first chapter, which might sound a bit bizarre, but essentially I used what I know about my own reading taste to inform me about things. So I'm trying to think of an example of this. I think maybe the best example is going to be The Book That Wouldn't Burn, because I found it decidedly mid in the opening chapter. I also found the racism to be a little sort of off-putting. Also, I went into it not having particularly high thoughts about Mark Lawrence as an author. This is a book that 100% I would not have picked up if not for this category. But when I was actually ranking the books, I said that Atalanta and The Unmaking of June Farrow were lower down in my ranking, but I just got a feeling based on the first chapter of The Book That Wouldn't Burn and how I responded to it that it was probably going to be one of the lowest ranked books. I hope that all makes sense. So now that we've gone over how I approached it, how I did it for free, let's get into what you are here for, and that is my thoughts on these different books. So in order to make this video a little bit interesting, I am going to be talking about these books based on how much I would want to leave. I'm going to take these off because I can hear them jingling and I'm sure they're probably not too nice for you. Sorry. So I'm going to be talking about these based on how much I would want to live in the fantasy world. So starting with the world of, well, not all of these are fantasy worlds. Sorry, not all of these are second world fantasy. So starting with the book that I would most like to live in the world and ending with the book that I would least like to live in the world. So first off, we have Bookshops and Bone Dust. It takes place in a second world with fantasy classes and magic as the norm. Overall, it seemed like a fine and cozy world. Yeah, there's a bit of necromancer terrorizing them every so often, but overall it just seems like a really cozy world. Also, I love Satchel. I want Satchel in my life. So how I actually felt about this book. I think cozy fantasy is something that I have to be in just the right frame of mind for. Like, for me, a lot of my reading has to be dark, emotional, those kind of things. And cozy, relatively low stakes, like I say, there is a necromancer terrorizing them. But like overall, low stakes, not much going on, not much going for it. It didn't work for me, unfortunately. I really wanted to like it. And as I say, I enjoyed Satchel, but overall I found it really dry. Also, the fact that I went into this book knowing that it was a sequel meant that a lot of the stakes were kind of nullified for me because Like, I haven't read Legends and Lattes, but I went into it being like, okay, well, this is like just for a summer, so nothing that happens is going to change the path that this character ends up taking. I couldn't really root for anything. Like, I couldn't really root for Viv staying where she is. I couldn't really root for the relationships. So it just unfortunately didn't quite click for me. Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. This is set in our world circa 1900, where fairies are accepted as being real. It was pretty cozy and sweet, and I like the idea of a world where people get offended when you try to pay for things. Also, a Fae, yeah, I'll take that. And whilst the Fae seem quite mischievous, they also seem to have very much like clear rules on how they operate. So as long as you're following the rules, you're going to be fine. And in some ways, like, that reflects how much I really like the Goblin Market in the Wayward Children series, in that there's set out rules and everything has a very clear, like, it makes sense. Based on the first chapter of this book, I thought I wasn't going to vibe with it. There was a disconnect for me. I wasn't sure about the fact that it's written as diary entries, but very quickly I got sucked into this book. It also helps that the audio production for this book is absolutely exceptional, to the point that I'm currently contemplating pre-ordering the sequel on audio because it was that good, the audiobook production. I did think there was possibly like a lot of little strands going on in the story, but somehow it came together in a really good story. I think potentially this could be described as a cozy fantasy, but I think the stakes felt a lot more real than, you know, Bookshops and Bone Dust. So I felt invested in it, and I think there was a lot of elements that kept me captivated and curious and wanting to just continue and pushing through. I absolutely adored this book, and it kind of took me by surprise because I had gone in not expecting to love it as much as I did. Starling House by Alix E. Harrow. This is a book that's set in our world with a dark, whimsical element that's somewhat reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland. This is a world where you get a free, creepy old house that you can call home, and all you have to do is battle some demons. Sounds like a pretty good deal. I picked up this book because I was so certain that this book was going to end up on the Goodreads Choice Awards. And looking back, I can't even remember what it was about this book that was like, it's going to be in the fantasy category. It's going to get at least long-listed. But I was like, yeah, it's going to be, which is, I think, the only book on this list that I picked up deliberately in advance of the long list because I was sure it was going to be on there. This was a book that, again, took me by surprise because I started listening to it and then it was like I couldn't stop listening. I started listening whilst I was visiting family, and I don't know what other people's family is like, other people's experience visiting family, but I find that like it's a lot of like seizing moments here and there to read when I'm visiting family, which is fine. Like, I'm visiting family, like I'm not there to read a book, I'm there to visit and spend time. So that's not a critique of my family if you're watching. I'm just saying I didn't have much time to read, but I was finding that like every spare moment that I could get to listen to this audiobook, I was grabbing it and going, I need to listen to more. I need to find out what's going to happen. I was so captivated. And then I went from visiting my family to travelling up to Edinburgh. And then B was going to meet me in Edinburgh. This is a bit of an aside. But anyway, B was going to meet me in Edinburgh, but I had a couple of hours where it was just me on my own in Edinburgh. and I'd originally planned to take a walk down to Arthur's Seat, but I could not stop listening to this audiobook. So instead, I sat in the hotel lobby and crocheted and listened to this audiobook compulsively and did not stop until I had finished it. I absolutely devoured it, and I really enjoyed it. I liked how kind of dark and eerie the setting was. I liked that there was a lot of mystery to the story, but it unfolded in a very timely manner, and just overall it was a treasure to listen to. The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Rushdie. This book takes place in our world, but with dark whimsy elements, somewhat like the previous book on this list, Starling House. Honestly, I have very strong feelings about this book and it being fantasy, because when I read it, it didn't read like fantasy. It reminded me of Pan's Labyrinth in that the book, as opposed to the film, because it's a lot more open to interpretation in the film, whereas the book, it's like the fairy tale fantastical elements are there to support the story, and you're not necessarily meant to believe they're really happening. But for me, calling this book fantasy is like calling a book where someone reads a fairy tale fantasy. Like, don't get me wrong, I get that it's meant to be magical realism and whatnot, but when I read it, the fantastical elements were not meant to be real. They were meant to be allegories. And, you know, I loved the book all the same. Like, don't get me wrong, like, me fighting people over saying that I don't believe it's fantasy is not me saying I dislike this book, and it's not me saying that this book doesn't deserve to be nominated. It's just that I didn't get fantasy vibes from it. So my only kind of ick with the world of this book, and it's so hyper specific and silly, but America, and I don't mean that in a disparaging to people of America, it's just that the whole lack of gun control and the way that bodily autonomy is policed there. And don't get me wrong, there are issues with bodily autonomy in the UK. I am not saying that Westminster doesn't have its issues. That's a whole other aside. But the idea of visiting America where gun control is basically non-existent freaks me out. So that's why, like, it's a note for me. And I think that comes up a couple of times on this list. So just bear in mind, if I'm saying America's the note for me, it's because I'm freaked out by the lack of gun control that they have there. This was a very strange book for me in that it took me until almost the end of the book to actually realise that I was enjoying it. I found it kind of mid as I was reading it, and then I got to the last few chapters and I absolutely adored it. I did think that the experience was somewhat ruined for me in that I guessed one of the major twists almost immediately, which meant that I was kind of waiting for the book to go, okay, yeah, you're right, this is the thing that happened. And that's something that in general I find quite frustrating in books, is when you see something and you're going, okay, just confirm it for me, just confirm it for me, and you're waiting and waiting for them to confirm it. And it's almost like I wish that I was wrong, so then I wouldn't have felt so frustrated waiting. But overall, I did have a good experience with this book. And yeah, whilst I'm not really sure I would class it as fantasy, I think it is a really solid book. And I definitely want to read more from Rushdie in the future. VenCo by Cherie, Dimaline. This is set in our world, but with witches very much a thing. The kind of setting of this book is dangerous and full of patriarchy woe, but I did like that the witches were trans affirming and trans inclusive in their covens. The bad guy was very complex in that, like, He was very attractive, very seductive. Like, you know, like when you read a mafia romance and you're like, this guy is really, really bad news, but also, yes. It was kind of like that. So, like, he wasn't great in terms of, like, you wouldn't want to live in a world where he existed. But also, the Coven was so badass. And I loved that for them. This was another book on this list that completely took me by surprise. So VenCo, I was only able to get as an ebook. So I wasn't able to get through it as quickly as others. Also, Tress, I'd like ranked lower in terms of, based on the first chapter, I thought I was going to enjoy Tress less than VenCo, which is true. But we'll get to that when we get to that. So I had to read Tress, which again, I only had as an ebook before I could get to VenCo. So VenCo was literally the very last book that I read for this. And I was fully expecting that either it was going to be a day and a half or that I was going to get a certain amount of the way through and go, okay, well, I want this video to be up. And realistically, I think, unfortunately, this is probably going to be the lowest rated book in this category. It does not deserve that, but I know that it's very hard to get your hands on a copy of this book. And also, like, the numbers that it has on Goodreads, we'll get to all the stats and the nerdy stuff towards the end of this video, but all the numbers would point towards it rating quite low. So I kind of went in with like very low, no expectations. I will say, in the first chapter, there is a Harry Potter reference. I think it's the first chapter. It might be the prologue. But there's a Harry Potter reference, and I hate that for it. But the book as a whole is so good. Like, so good. It's one of those situations where, like, you don't want to comp title it to something, but a good comp title for it is definitely the Her Majesty's Royal Coven. It's got that vibe of like adult witches being bad bitches kind of situation, and also the fact that it is trans inclusive and like various things like that. I also really liked that there's these group of people that are referred to as Mother, Maiden and Crone. One of the things that I guess let it down slightly for me was that I saw one, I don't know if you'd call it a twist, but like I saw one of the reveals coming and I was like, oh no, surely not. But no, it was exactly as I thought it would be. But that's fine. I overall thought it was quite amusing at places. There were a few times where the writing felt a little clunky, or it would talk about something that just felt a little uncomfortable and a little off. But overall, it was an incredibly solid book. And the fact that I managed to read it in a few days shows how compulsive it was to read. And it was definitely one of those books that I was like, one more chapter, one more chapter, one more chapter. Oops, I haven't slept. One more chapter then. And it was like that. So I definitely think more people should be picking it up. And I really hope for its sake it doesn't come 20th. Like, you know, obviously to be nominated at all, you know, is great. It's getting eyes on it. But like, it needs even more eyes on it because it really is absolutely incredible. And the fact that we're following people that are in their like late 40s, 50s. I think we've got a spectrum of ages within the kind of main cast of characters. I think Lucky, the main protagonist, is maybe around 30 years old. I can't remember exactly, but I'd say she's about 30. But then you've got characters that are in either their late 40s or their early 50s. You've got one character who I think is, you know, meant to be somewhere between 18 and 21. So we've got a full spectrum of ages. We've got a lot of racial diversity. I had a really good time with it. And as Cherie Dimaline says at the end of the acknowledgements, today is a good day to hex the patriarchy. The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. This is a secondary world which is simultaneously the past and the future, and it's largely set inside a library. I kind of would love to live in a library, and it does sound like fun. Not a big fan of the racism that exists within the book, and the antagonists would make it a less than ideal life to live. Okay, so the fact that I would like to live in the library is probably the only good thing I can say about this book. So, putting aside my issues with Mark Lawrence, I went into this book with an open mind, and to say that I despised it would be to put it too lightly. I want this book to have never existed. I have been referring to it as the book that I wish had burnt. I hate this book. Right. So, trigger warning for discussion of paedophilia, grooming, that kind of thing, right? So, as I was reading this book, you are following two characters, which I can't remember their names, and I don't care enough to remember their names. But you've got a girl who's, I don't know, let's say she's 10 years old, and we've got a guy that's 20. We know the girl is heading to the library. We know the guy is stuck inside the library, right? So I'm going, oh no. You've got a 10-year-old heading to a library where a 20-year-old is. This is already setting off red flags for me, especially because the 20-year-old is part of a group of people and he is the youngest of them. Already massive red flags. And then the girl gets to the library and the guy's not there, because timey-wimey things are happening. So I'm going, okay. Maybe it's going to be fine. Maybe, you know, timey-wimey things will make it fine. I had a prediction about how the girl was going to factor into the guy's life, and I was correct in that, which was annoying as well, because I was like, I guessed this pretty near the start. Hate it. Also, this book is romantasy, and I will fight people who say that it shouldn't have been in the romantasy category. Like, this is romantasy. The whole point of this book is the romance. It literally ends by one of the characters going, I know how to get your girl. And that's where, like, the next part of the series is going to go, is them trying to get his girl. Okay? Right. I'm in full bloody rant mode now. So, this girl is like 10 years old. She might be slightly older, but she's a child. He is a 20-year-old man. And, you know, timey-wimey things happen. She ends up in the library that he's in, and they sort of hang out and connect. Again, could be completely innocent, except the whole book then proceeds to make it this epic love story about how they've been divided by time, and, you know, she fell for him when she was a 10-year-old and he fell for her when she was a 10-year-old. And yes, they only see each other 3 times between, like, their first meeting and then, like, you know, her actually being 20. But this book establishes that they both fell for each other when she was a 10-year-old and he was a grown man. Angry. Just angry at this book. Angry that this is the central romance. Angry that you're meant to root for them. Angry at the racism in this book. Angry at the way the antagonists are framed. Angry that I called what was going on with the antagonists. Just angry at this book. I wish I could scrub this book from my brain. I hated it so much. Wonder if you can guess what's in the 20th position of the books that I read. Who knows? Okay. Victory City by Salman Rushdie. This is a book that's set in our world between the 14th to 16th century in South India. It's not the best world to have been a woman or perceived as a woman, but it's also such a vibrant world, and there's always the chance to live your forest lesbian dreams. So this book is a fictionalized history of a particular empire that existed in southern India during the 14th to 16th century. And it's following the life of a character who I find her name really fun to say. It's Kompa. And you're following her right from when she's a child to when she's over 200 years old. And it was just so captivating to follow this character throughout her life, to see her fall in love, to see her have children, to see her grieve, because she does live to be over 200 years old. So it's like everyone she ever loves dies. And like, that's not a spoiler. If you live to be over 200 years old, that is just a reality of life. But there was just such a magic to this book. It was so vibrant, it was so interesting, but also it touched on hard topics, as well as the way that it almost had a Pratchett-esque omniscient narrator translator kind of thing. So the idea is that the narrator of this story is kind of framed as the translator of Kompa story that she wrote herself and then was left undiscovered for 400 years. The narrator doesn't have a strong voice, but you do see it come through in critiques of characters' actions, for example. Like, there's one point where Kompa is a young girl and she is living with a monk in a cave. And you have this thing where it's like, well, the monk would say he never touched her. And then the narrator's voice would come through and go, but the monk was lying. And like, it was so biting that I couldn't help but appreciate it. And then there are other moments as well where Kompa got her revenge, and it was very much a I support women's wrongs kind of situation. This book was so enjoyable to go from start to finish, and it actually really frustrated me that it was one of the books I got from the library, because it meant that I don't own a copy. And of all the books that I read for this video, I mean, obviously I now own a copy of most of them because I got them through Audible, but the fact that I got this book through the library, which means that I don't own a copy of it, and I immediately want to reread it and return to this world. And if I'm being completely honest, I may in fact reread it before the month's out, because it was just that good and I just want to luxuriate in this story all over again. Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is a second world fantasy where instead of the oceans and seas being made up of water, they are made up of deadly spores. My toxic trait is believing that I would thrive in this world. This is a book that I really wanted to enjoy, like really wanted to enjoy, but I didn't. So I went into this having only read like 280 pages or whatever of Brandon Sanderson before. So I'm technically currently reading The Final Empire. I don't know if I'm going to have to soft DNF it because I don't have enough time before the end of the year, but we'll see. But I am technically reading The Final Empire at the moment, and I've got far enough into the book that I feel fairly confident in saying that I don't have an issue with Sanderson's writing style. Like, I can enjoy something that Sanderson writes. But I found this book really challenging, even from the start, where the narrator's voice was not one that I enjoyed. Okay, I'm going to put my hand up, minor spoiler. So this book is narrated by a character called Hoyd, who I haven't met yet in Sanderson's books, but I believe he does pop up in book 2 of Mistborn. So I get that there is a reason why the narrator's voice is the way that it is, but I found it really difficult to connect to that voice because they weren't a nice person, and you kind of want your narrator to feel like they're telling you a story in front of a crackling fire with a warm cup of hot chocolate in front of you. If the narrator's going to have a strong voice, they need to be a voice that you want to listen to. And that was a struggle for me, was that I didn't want to listen to the voice. And I think as a result of the narrator voice, I didn't like Tress. But another thing that didn't work for me was that, for whatever reason, I thought that Tress was going to continue going to places, but it was like Tress got to where she was at around 20% of the book, and then she didn't go anywhere from there. So I felt like I was waiting for the story to move, for me to get somewhere new, for something else to happen. But that wasn't the story. Like, the story was meant to be like Tress in the place that she was at 20%. And it's just not the kind of story that I enjoy in general. I think, to kind of layer onto this, there's the fact that I found the world with these spores and the way that they can be manipulated to be really interesting. I just didn't like the story that was being told in this particular world. But again, like, I get why the story was the story it was, because it enabled you to explore all of these different spores and the way they can be used, but the way that they can also be incredibly dangerous. But I just didn't like that story. The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by S.A. Chakraborty. This is a secondary world roughly based on the Ottoman Empire. Apparently the pirate life isn't for me. I don't know, it sounds okayish but also dull. It's hard for me to be objective because I read this book a fair while ago and it just didn't hit. So I feel like I read this book almost a year ago. I don't know when I actually read it, but it was a while. And something wasn't clicking for me. I think this is a book that feels like a first book in a series, in that things don't happen and you're waiting for the story to begin. Like, that's not to say there's nothing that happens in this book, but I just felt like I was waiting to get to a point, and then we only really got to the point at the end of the book, and I'm like, okay, but I need the story now. I need you to give me the second book so I have the story that I've been waiting all book for. So that was a shame. You know, I liked who the narrator turned out to be. I liked the narrator's voice, but I also didn't like that it was handled as a reveal, because it was one of those where, like, it felt almost cheap that it was a reveal. I don't know. It didn't work for me, unfortunately, and I know this is a really loved book. People have really responded to it, but it just wasn't for me, unfortunately. But that's not to say that perhaps if I were to return to it in the future, that I potentially could love it in the future. But when I read it, it didn't work for me at all. The Fragile Threads of Power by V. Schwab. This is a sort of second world fantasy. It's set around the time of Regency England, but it's 4 different Londons layered on top of each other. So each of them are roughly based on Regency London, but there are second worlds in this book. It's really hard for me to be unbiased when it comes to this book because I love Red London, but like, I wouldn't want to live in White London, and it's not like, if I'm judging them based on the worlds I want to live in, It's not as if I can pick, because this book takes place in White London as much as it takes place in Red London. So this is a book I loved. Like, are we surprised that the person with a Schwab tattoo, and not only a Schwab tattoo, but a tattoo from the world of the Shades of Magic, loved the Shades of Magic book? Not at all. I do have I have a vlog of when I read this book, which is spoiler free. And then I think it's a 30-minute review, which I go into full spoilers with theories and stuff. So if you want like more full thoughts than I have time for in this video, please do check out those videos. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I thought that it did a really good job of bringing all readers in. So whether you had read the original Shades trilogy, or whether this was your first time exploring the world of the Shades of Magic, I felt like it brought you up to date pretty well. I can see where people might critique it in terms of pacing and it feeling first booky, but I liked it. I also thought that there are a lot of things that felt like a masterclass in craft, because looking back at the things that I highlighted and knowing where the story went, I could see all the clever little hints and building blocks that were in place where you go, this is amazing. This is so fantastically done. And overall, I just had a really good time with it. Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. This is another second world fantasy book that feels very much like Regency England. It seems fine. It's not as if I'd be aristocracy in this world anyway, and that's who seems to have all of the issues. The average Joe seems to have an okay life, as long as they're not, I think they're called Ashkar, basically Jewish in this book. Like, there's rampant anti-Semitism in this world, but beyond that, like, it's okay. And that's not to say the anti-Semitism isn't a big issue, because it is. It's kind of the driving force of the story. This was another book that felt like a book one. It didn't go anywhere particularly interesting. I found it so draggy. It spent so much time explaining the world where it just wasn't necessary or relevant. I don't know. It had real pacing issues. I did like the look into the history of the world and the way that the Jewish characters kind of their history. But overall, it didn't quite click for me. I also had issues with the way that the representation was displayed. So this is a queer normative world, right? And both Cal and Connor, the swordcatcher and the prince, are queer. But it kind of fell, and this is weird because Cassandra Clare does generally write queer characters, so it's not a new thing for Cassandra Clare to have queer characters in the book. But it almost felt like every so often you'd have an awkward moment where it almost felt like Clare was going, reminder, this character's queer. Look, he's thinking about having sex with a guy. And it was like, it felt really awkward. And, you know, that's not to say that, you know, a character ending up with one gender over another erases a bisexual identity or whatever. But it just felt like these things were put in for kind of brownie points without the correct payoff to go, okay, so here's what we're putting in to show that they are a fully rounded character. I don't know if that makes sense. It didn't quite sit right with me. But also, and this is hard as well, because I believe that Cassandra Clare is Jewish, but the Jewish characters felt really awkward and it felt clumsy almost. I don't know, it wasn't giving. I don't know what I wanted it to give me, but it wasn't giving. There was one moment where I teared up because a moment came out of nowhere and I was shook. But otherwise, unfortunately, it just again wasn't a hit for me. A Day, a Full Night by Samantha Shannon. This is a secondary world based around the cardinal points with wyverns, dragons and a pandemic. I would love to say that I'd like to live in this world because of the dragons, but dragon riders are much rarer in this book than they are in Priory. And also there's a pandemic in this book, which is not something that I would like to be in the world for. I found it really interesting that, like, I almost didn't pick up on the pandemic. Like, I was aware there was a sickness going on, but, like, I didn't twig that it was a pandemic until I listened to the, like, author interview at the end of the book. And Samantha Shannon was like, you wouldn't believe it, but, like, this was already in the book before the pandemic happened. And that was really interesting. So I felt the way about this book that I felt about Priory, in that there are about 3.5 billion characters in this book, and a better reader than me would be able to tell you exactly who those characters are and, you know, exactly what their plotlines and arcs are. But for me, it was about vibes, but those vibes were impeccable. I was loving this book. I was hooked. But if anyone asked me to tell you anything that happened in this book, I would not be able to tell you. Like, it's one of those books that I couldn't spoil even if I tried, because it's just pure vibes. But the vibes were so good. So many queer characters, so many queer happy endings. Like, it was fantastic. I had a really good time with it. But I couldn't tell you anything that happened. Inkblood Sister Scribe by Emma Tersch. This book is set in our world, but with magical books. The books sound incredible, but dangerous, and I don't love how open to abuse they are. This was a book that, again, kind of took me by surprise because it was a lot better than I expected. I do think the ending felt a little bit dragged out, but I think potentially what he's trying to do is set up a sequel, so it had this prolonged ending to set up a sequel. But what I think would have worked better is if it was a lot more compact and streamlined as an ending. I think you still could have had a sequel, but you didn't need quite so much fluff and padding around the ending. I was very hooked to see how the books worked, because you're plopped into this world where most of the characters don't really understand the mechanisms. Like, they understand that magic books exist, they understand that there are these spells that they can carry out, but they don't really know the ins and outs of them. So as a reader, you only know as much as the characters know, and the characters don't know enough to be able to fully flesh out this world to you. So it was quite fun to be exploring and seeing all of the things that unfolded, and a lot of it I didn't see coming. Like, there were a number of like twists and turns that were just kind of unexpected, and I really appreciated that it took me by surprise. Also, as a debut, it was really solid. Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. This is set in our world, Yale, but with magic. I would say that places like Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, etc. have never really appealed to me, but that would be a massive lie, because I did dream of attending Harvard at one point. I think the problem with living in this world is that you're at risk of being taken advantage of by the societies, even more so if you're not a society member. So when it comes to this book, I don't know if it just couldn't live up to how good Ninth House was, because Ninth House I adored. I had a really good time with it. But I don't know if it was that Ninth House was so good, so Hellbent needed to at least reach that level or surpass it, and it just didn't. I don't know if, because I had expected to love this book, this was one of the last fantasy books that I read for this video project, so I was already feeling burned out, and that's what went wrong. I don't know if because I did it as an audiobook, whereas Ninth House I did as an ebook, maybe there was a disconnect with the audio, and it was just one of those rare books where the audio didn't work for me. But I didn't love it. Like, there was some good moments, there was some good reveals, but overall it just didn't hit in the way that I hoped it would. And that's a real shame, because I was so excited to read this book, because Ninth House I had such a good time with, but I think maybe there was too much going on, too much back and throw, and it just didn't work. But again, it's one that I could see myself rereading fairly soon, especially because I did like Ninth House so much. So I would like to love Hellbent, but I don't know if I will. Also, I felt like, so Ninth House did end in very much a way that you knew there was going to be sequel, but I thought Hellbent ended in a way that, you know, when there's a sequel and it's almost like the book just gets chopped, and it felt not like a cliffhanger, but just like I was missing more of the book, and that was a shame. But we'll see if I still feel that way when the third book comes out and how I respond on reread. The Unmaking of June Farrow by Adrienne Young. This is set in our world, but predominantly 60s America. America isn't really my cup of tea anyway, and 60s America just sounds kind of hellish. So this was one of those books that was like really slow to get into. It was kind of intriguing, the idea of a generational curse with these women, but overall just something wasn't clicking immediately, and that kind of continued. Like, I didn't see the timey-wimey aspect coming, which is good. Like, it's nice to be surprised by a book, but I also just thought it was a bit kind of there was nothing about it that kind of excited me and made me feel like I had to compulsively read it. It was one of those books where I go, yeah, it was like definitely mid. I think as well, it had a kind of like romanticy feel to it, in that a lot of the story was revolving around the central romance, but I think also there was kind of a murder mystery to it, lots of mystery to it. It just didn't hit for me. It was just so decidedly mid. Atalanta by Jennifer Saint. This book is set in our world in the time of the Greeks. Artemis is very, very cruel, and in general, the Greeks just like to mess with mortals. I don't know how I felt overall about like this particular genre of book, because the market does feel incredibly saturated with Greek mythology retellings, and it feels like a really weird one where, like, if you are too familiar with the story, it just doesn't hit the same, and it feels very obviously like a retelling. Like, I like my retellings to add some spice and something different and feel unique. And Atalanta, yes, you know, you don't hear about the female Argonaut, and there were some things around her life that were kind of interesting. But overall, it was very much like, these are the beats of the Argonaut's journey. And I also thought there was some pacing where some scenes seemed to go on for a long time, and then other scenes, it was like blink and you miss it. Like the way that Atalanta was raised, and it felt like you didn't get enough time in kind of her childhood and her background, but at the same time, you got a lot of time with her and Artemis. I don't know, it felt very contradictory, the pacing. Also, like, always fun the amount of essay there is in Greek mythology, and the way that the women are always punished for being attacked. Delightful. I mean, I get that it's like true to the mythology, but it's just not something I particularly enjoy. And I don't know, just it wasn't my cup of tea at all. I did think it was interesting that you had this character who had a lot of respect and love for Artemis, so you were seeing a very cruel character through the lens of someone that loved and respected her, which was a bit hard for me as well, because I think if you go into the story not knowing too much about Artemis, maybe you feel differently. But I read Medusa by Jessie Burton a year or two back, and I went into Atalanta with preconceived notions about Artemis. So I already had a bias there. And like, I mean, this book just confirmed my bias, rightly so. But I found it very difficult to read passages where Atalanta was being so positive about Artemis, knowing how cruel and horrible she is. And you do see that, but also you see someone who is essentially a child who is struggling to see that her parental figure is complex and flawed. Clytemnestra by Constanza Casati. This is another book that's set in our world, but in the time of the Greeks. It's not a world I would like to live in because Clytemnestra had a really hard life and not fun the way that people seem to be sacrificed willy-nilly. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. Like, I went into it fully expecting to find it a vibe because the way that it was framed as Clytemnestra kind of choosing women's wrongs was such a vibe. Also, like, this book and the next book that I'm going to talk about, very much women's wrongs books, and I loved them. They were so much fun. Clytemnestra is someone that's so headstrong and knew what she wanted, but was forced into this really small box where she couldn't be the person that she was. So she schemed and was really clever about it, played the long game, and then went, I'm going to come out on top. I know I'm a queen. I know I'm destined to be a queen. I know I'm going to stay a queen, and this is how I'm going to do it. And it just made for a really enjoyable read. There were times when I was like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I love that. I think as well, what made this book more engaging for me is that Clytemnestra's not a story that you see told a lot. Like, you get a lot of Medusa, you get Odysseus, you get Helen of Troy. Like, there are a number of Greek mythology figures that you go, yeah, that story's pretty well known, see a lot of that. But Clytemnestra, like, I knew some of the characters on the periphery of her life. Like, I knew Theseus, I knew Odysseus, Helen, but I didn't really know Clytemnestra's story, and it was really interesting. Also, I loved the fact that Clytemnestra was trained very much as a Spartan, so she had these strong fighting skills, but she was also very tactical, very smart. Just overall, great book to get your teeth stuck into. So Stone Blind, as I said, is another women's wrong books. This is by Natalie Haynes, and again set in the time of the Greeks, and the Greek gods take a lot of joy in terrorizing people and playing God. Duh. This was such an interesting book. It was unlike any Greek book I'd read before, and it made it so compelling. So it's told in really short snapshots into different point of views. So it's a massive multi-point of view story, but they build and build to show you the picture as a whole. I really enjoyed the way that it was framing Medusa as the victim. I like that this is becoming a more common thing with Greek mythology, where we're seeing Medusa not as the bad person, but as someone who was very much wronged. I also liked the snapshots of the scheming of the gods, and oh gosh, what was that? I think the Gorgonea point of view was really snarky. We got some really unique point of views at one point. I won't spoil what those were, but overall it made for such a captivating book, and the way that it just had such a forward momentum because you had these short chapters from these characters, and the fact that there was snark to it, the fact that there was so much women's wrongs and the characters got their comeuppance. It was a really satisfying story. And I went into this book because I'd read Jessie Burton's Medusa, kind of being like, well, how is a book going to compare? Because Jessie Burton did such a good job, but Natalie Haynes did it. She did it. It was so good, so enjoyable. Thoroughly recommend. I would say of the Greek mythology books on this list, Clytemnestra and Stoneblind, I would both recommend. Atalanta, I would say just give it a miss. It's not that great. It's just very bog standard. But Clytemnestra and Stoneblind, like Stoneblind's the most unique one, but Clytemnestra is potentially a story you haven't heard before. So yeah, good times. The Will of the Many by James Islington. It's a secondary world with large Roman Empire influences, and the magic system feels almost Star Wars-esque. Like, it put me in mind of, is it called midichlorians? I want to say mitochondria, but it's not mitochondria. I think it's like midichlorians. And that's how the magic felt. It's a very cool world, but also a cruel world where those in power subjugate those they see as below them, and things are even more messed up than they first appear. I had such a good time with this. Like, this is a chunky book, but it was one of those where, like, I had to keep reading. I needed to know what was going to go on. Like, I think this is technically dark academia, but with it being in a sort of Romanesque setting, it has a different flavour to it. I like the way that this was a setting that felt both classical and futuristic. The ending slightly pickled my brain, but I think it's one of those that will make a lot more sense once the series continues and you get more answers. But I liked the slow reveal of our main character's backstory. I liked all the scheming and politicking. Politically? Is that a word? I don't know. It's now. But it was such a strongly constructed story where everything kind of came together in a really satisfying way. And it also, like, it didn't pull punches. It had some really heartbreaking moments. And I'm like, give me the next one now, please. I really want to continue this series, which is a rarity for me because I get so intimidated by chunky books, and I shouldn't, because chunky books are doable, and I like a chunky book where I can get sucked into the world. But this was such a good book. And then the final book that we have to talk about is Witch King by Martha Wells, which is a secondary world with demons, necromancy, and religious knots. Honestly seems kind of hellish, and it seems like no one has a good time in this world. So for this one, I'm going to keep it kind of brief because I really should have DNF'd it because something wasn't clicking for me. And like, I actually couldn't tell you much about this book because that's how much it didn't click. Like, I don't feel like I absorbed any of it. And it could be that audiobook formats don't work for me. It could be that Martha Wells' writing doesn't work for me, because in the past I have read the first Murderbot book and I did it as an audiobook as well, and I didn't click with that. So I'm wondering if it's Martha Wells as an audiobook or Martha Wells in general. But this book had, like, it had all the hallmarks of something that I would like. Like, it's literally called Witch King. It's a demon who is witchy. There's all this like scheming going on. I mean, I said there was necromancy. I don't know if there is, but like, it feels dark and delicious, but I just really struggled with it to the point that like I couldn't tell you anything about it. It should have been a DNF, but my completionist heart was like, nope, got to read them all, got to finish them all, even if I can't tell you anything about them. So that is the 20 books that I read. Now we're going to have a wee reveal where I show you my final ranking of all of the books. I'm going to pop a graphic on screen and talk you through them. So we've got this funky wee graphic here, and I'm going to reveal one by one my final ranking for these books. Can you guess what's in my 20th position? It's the book that wouldn't burn, because of course it is. What's in 19? It's Tress. Are we shocked? I don't know if we're shocked. I was shocked. I really thought I was going to enjoy it a bit more than I did. In 18th, we have Swordcatcher. It just wasn't a great time for me, unfortunately. And then we've got Witch King, which surprisingly, even though it should have been a DNF and I didn't vibe with that much, ranks higher than 3 books below that, which I think says it all about those books. And then we have The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi. I wanted to love it, but I just didn't, unfortunately. Then The Unmaking of June Farrow. Oh, you can kind of see what number 9 is. Take a guess in the comments what you think number 9 is. And then in 14 we have Bookshops and Bone Dust. It's just too cozy for me. I need a bit more darkness in my stories. Then we have Atalanta and Inkblood Sister Scribe and Hellbent, revealing itself a bit early there. Got Hellbent in 11th position. Okay, so in 10th we have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride. In 9th we have Clytemnestra. Well done if you guessed that based on the tiny slither we saw. In 8 we have Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes. In 7th we have A Day of Fallen Night. In 6th, Victory City. Such a good book. Highly, highly recommend. In 5 we have The Will of the Many by James Islington. And 4, VenCo, a surprise last minute top edition. And The Fragile Threads of Power. Are we surprised that that isn't my top book? I was surprised. But also recency bias could come into that. Then we have Starling House by Alix E. Harrow. And my best book is, I mean, of course, you know what it is. There's only one book remaining. But Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries. And we're just going to take that overlay off and we are going to add in that one that shows you my ranking, but only showing the shortlist. So you can see that apparently I'm so not like other readers that 5 of the shortlist are in my bottom 7. So that is my final ranking. So before I close out this video, I wanted to talk about a couple of common themes I've seen within these books. There are a number of mythology books. Like the fact that the long list had 3 Greek mythology books, and I was surprised that none of them made it into the top 10. I mean, it kind of made sense when you looked at the numbers, and especially because having 3 means you split the votes between people that would vote for Greek mythology. Another common theme I saw was time travel, with 2 of the books having time travel in them. I also saw that there's not much of like fantasy classes like orcs and dwarves and stuff in fantasy this year, or at least in popular fantasy. And another thing that I recognised was things like necromancy. I'm sure there are other common themes, but those are some of the themes that I saw in common with the books this year. So lastly, let's talk about who I think will win. I think it's either going to be Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo or Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. I think there's an outside chance that Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries could win because it has been doing pretty well. People are responding to it really positively. But it's an interesting year in that I think Hellbent and Tress of the Emerald Sea, like the numbers for both of them are pretty close and I could see it going either way. So I'm pretty interested to see who ends up winning. So, you know, we know that Goodreads is a popularity contest, but I'm going to pop a graphic on screen just to show you something. Okay, so this is a graphic of what I predicted the shortlist for the fantasy category this year would be. Like, this is knowing who'd made it onto the long list. This is who I predicted would be on the shortlist. So going purely by numbers, I've got a not very complicated algorithm which looks at the amount of people that have shelved it, the amount of people that have rated it, what the current rating is, how popular the author is in terms of number of followers on Goodreads, and sort of works it out and puts an order there. So going by the numbers, you can see that we had Tress of the Emerald Sea, Hellbent, The Fragile Threads of Power, Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries, Starling House, The Unmaking of June Farrow, The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi, Swordcatcher, Stoneblind, and A Day of Fallen Night. And then from gut instinct, I thought that we weren't going to get The Unmaking of June Farrow, we weren't going to get Stoneblind, and we weren't going to get A Day of Fallen Night. So Stoneblind was just, I didn't feel like we were going to get the Greek mythology. I felt like the votes were being split or whatever. A Day of Fallen Night, the numbers weren't that great, and it being a chunk, I thought would intimidate people. But also, I wasn't sure because Priory was so well received, and it is an excellent book. And then The Unmaking of June Farrow, I'd only heard mediocre things about it, but clearly, like, I was just not hearing the right things. So I thought we were going to get The Will of the Many in The Book That Wouldn't Burn, because I thought we were going to see like a male traditional fantasy, and I thought we were going to see both of those in the shortlist. But what I think is really interesting when I look at this is if you look at the side that's by the numbers, so completely ignore like my gut instinct side, you'll see that the only book going by the numbers that didn't make it to the shortlist was Stoneblind, and instead we got Bookshops and Bone Dust, which does somewhat track with kind of what I expected. And I think it's kind of interesting that I put Bookshops and Bone Dust in the place where Stoneblind would be, because that's essentially what has happened. So looking at that graphic, you can see, well, you know, we know Goodreads is a popularity contest. We know that people vote for authors they like, even though they may not have read the book. Like, it makes sense when you look at the numbers, but it becomes really apparent looking at these numbers just how much that it doesn't really matter how good a book is. It's going to be there. You just have to look at the numbers, and you can predict everything just based on numbers. I will say I have looked at other categories, and it's not quite as cut and dry in other categories, but I'm very interested to see who does actually win. Like, I would love personally for V. Schwab to win, because I massively respect Schwab as an author, and I think The Fragile Threads of Power was great. Obviously, my personal favourite was Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries, but again, I read that quite recently, so that's probably why I'm ranking it higher. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for sticking around. Please comment down below any thoughts you had about any of these fantasy books, and until tomorrow, love you, bye.